Yeah, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are located at the moment in the world. I have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Sudhir Rao. Mr. Sudhir Rao in India needs no introduction. He is a veteran of the industry, automotive and transportation industry. He is the former managing director of Bombardier Transportation India. In addition, he also has been the former chairman and managing director of Skoda India and global automotive transportation CEO, as he is over the years. In the past, he has represented Renault and General Motors as well in leadership positions. He has got experience across India, USA, and Europe in creating and building, transforming companies to be sustainable and profitable businesses. While some Western automotive giants such as General Motors and Harley-Davidson of late recently in India have decided to move on from India, from the India ventures, Mr. Rao played at the same time an important role in making Renault and Skoda in India among the most sustainable Western car brands in India. I've known Mr. Rao for some years now, and I can tell you that he has a very amiable personality, but at the same time, he could be a very tough decision maker when the need arises. So thank you, Mr. Rao, once again for joining us today. I'm sure the audience will certainly benefit from your knowledge, wisdom, and experience. And as the topic today is about manufacturing in India. Now, as you're aware, because of the last year's events and also a few years ago because of the government's push on making in India, manufacturing in India is becoming a topic which is there for discussion almost every day. But before that, I think many times we are asked by companies, why should we go to India at all? So maybe we start with that first and then come why make in India. Over to you.
Sure. It's a very good question as to why should we go to India at all. I think one is sometimes boards kick managements into going to India because they hear a lot and they say, how come you're not in China? How come you're not in India? I mean, that's a very common question, I suspect, in boardrooms around the world. The second motivation sometimes comes that, well, there's another thing which is the pull, which is India has been trying to attract foreign investment for several years. I would say at least about 2.5 decades now. So that's the other side. The third factor that comes in is companies' desire to access a very, very large market. It is either the largest or the second largest population in the world, depending on which statistic you believe. And more importantly, it is a growing economy. It is the last mega growth economy that is still available in the world. So there's a lot of animal spirits or business greed, if you will, to come and come into this market and get the profits that are promised to be there. Finally, it's probably a cost strategy, which is that India will provide me a low-cost manufacturing source, a low-cost product development / IT software technology, if you will, source that is easy to operate in culturally and from a language perspective. So I'd say these are the broad reasons why people get interested in India and eventually, evaluate extensively and, hopefully more often than not decide to come.
Okay, thank you. A lot of our participants today represent companies which are not very large companies. They would be, of course, Skoda and General Motors and all very large organizations, of Bombardier for that matter. Many of them would be representing mid-size, small to mid-size companies, right? The SME sector. What would you say about those kind of companies? Should they also be looking at India, or they are maybe too way behind, in the queue?
Oh, yeah, I think it depends on the industry and the product you have. Very often, you may be a supplier to a much larger company, which has come to India or is in the process of coming to India. And they will request strongly that you please follow them and support their business in India as well as you are doing elsewhere in the world for them. That is one reason to be asked, if you will, to come. The second thing is, I think depending on the product, if there's a market in India for your product, I would say it is certainly worth at least evaluating a local presence. Whether you do that presence through sales, your own sales as opposed to an agent, whether you do that through your own manufacturing or just importing product, is of course very, very specific to the product, the company, the context, the size of India as a market compared to your global size, and so forth. So I certainly would encourage anybody who's on the call to look at India, and I suppose they are already interested, otherwise they wouldn't be here. But I certainly would not assume that India doesn't have opportunities, either as a market or as a very competitive internal manufacturing source. I would definitely look. And I'm not saying this from a PR perspective. I'd like to think I'm a very balanced individual. I don't always buy in all the uber hype about India, but I do believe that there is strong potential for most companies if you handle your execution correctly.
Okay. So coming to the execution, so when it comes to sales and trading activities, that's let's say slightly tamer animal to tame, or less wilder an animal. But when it comes to manufacturing, a lot of companies of late have been looking at India not only as an alternative to the other hot destinations for manufacturing, but like you said, some of them do find that their principals or their tier OEMs are asking them to come to India. So when these companies look at India, the bigger ones, of course, have all the wherewithal, right? They can actually do whatever they want. But for the mid-size, small to mid-size companies, mostly promoter-driven companies, why should they look at manufacturing? You already mentioned that they might be drawn or called for. But generally speaking, if they were to look at India, what do you think? Because I'm sure as an OEM yourself, and you had several such suppliers, both international and Indian suppliers. What typical challenges do you think which deter these companies? Even somebody like Skoda says, you please come to India because you have to supply to me, but because of their experiences and all. So what challenges, I mean, maybe two parts of the question, what challenges do you typically see? And how do you help, I mean, or how have you helped in your past roles these companies to overcome? Because they come from a Western mindset, right? May not understand India exactly from the manufacturing perspective. So maybe some thoughts.
So if you are coming in as a tiered supplier to a larger company, and that is your primary motive to come here, evaluate carefully how large the company that you're going to supply to, how large a player, how established is it in India, and decide for, if this is the only business I end up getting in India, can I still make a profitable company for myself? And therefore, you have to evaluate the prospects of your customer and their status in the country. It can sometimes be risky. I mean, I know some companies, for example, and I can say this because this was 20 years ago, may have followed General Motors in. But it took a while for General Motors to establish. The first 2-3 years of life for GM, maybe even 5 years, when these suppliers came in, was extremely difficult. And you couldn't break into any other customers because the biggest market was with Indian or Japanese firms at the point. So with the result that you have to say, okay, if this is the only customer I have, do I have a critical mass of business to be able to come in and sustain myself? Point number one. Point number two, how long a contract is this company going to give me? Because very often what happens is, at least in the industry I'm in, there is a product evolution. And if tomorrow they say, you know what, we find that you're not competitive enough, we've been here 5 years, we are now going to go to an Indian company or any company that's been here, doesn't have to be Indian, who's more competitive. I've given you enough time to now find your feet. Thank you very much. You have to compete like everybody else. So the longevity of your contracts, the strength of your historical relationship with that firm becomes really critical. I generally have not had too many disasters in my experience. As being involved in purchasing with large companies, I've had several companies that have set up operations in India, to serve. and eventually all of them have figured out how to succeed and go beyond that initial company that brought them into the country. There are cases where people have decided to fold up and move on, but I would say the success rate in my experience has been about 80 to 90%.
Okay, so
So
this was for the
definitely possible,
sorry.
and definitely do it. Have a strong relationship with your OEM that's bringing you in. We can maybe get into the detail later, but one of the key things is not to go into an industrial. This is my personal view. Others may differ. Not to go into an industrial cluster that is very mature, because what happens is you go into a situation where the overall wage structure or union culture, etc., has already advanced to a point where your employees are going, especially on the workforce front, are going to expect a certain culture that is not you want to create to begin with. So that is one key thing when you decide your entry strategy, is where is your customer, and is that a good location for me to be in, or am I asking for trouble?
Okay. And then coming to, I would say, related kind of a question is that while location, of course, is important, and later after your session, I'll also be speaking a little about that. But how should one, come into India? Should one come on their own? Should they look for a partner, for a JV, or some kind of a contract manufacturing? What would your experience say on this topic? What is the best way or the ideal way?
Generally, my default advice is come on your own. So that's sort of the default advice. And then the reason is actually fairly straightforward. I think you spend a lot of time in the beginning of setting up a company in India, making sure you're competitive, making sure your values transfer, making sure your technology is understood by your employees, by your suppliers, by your tooling manufacturers, etc., etc. So there's a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of detail associated with those initial years, months, to make sure your foundation is correct. Now, if in addition to this, you're also dealing with making a joint venture evolve and ensure it succeeds for the long term, you're adding a major complication. And so the preparatory part is really important. And I feel that, like I said, my default advice is go on your own, because it's easier, more straightforward, and you're really focused on developing the product that you know in your way and making it successful. I think the key is to do the research, if you will, be very Japanese oriented. They spend years and years planning, meticulous planning, and very quick execution, because their plan is so thorough. And that is the
Okay.
important part, is have a very, very thorough, well thought through plan with people on the ground who've understood it, have got wide varieties of opinion, and have made up their mind.
Okay, thank you. Related again, another topic which is kind of a moving forward. When companies look at India, India still is not, for majority of companies, again, mid-sized companies or small to mid-sized companies, still not seen as an efficient country, or a quality conscious country, right? I mean, I'm sure you would also have heard of it from your suppliers in the past, or your colleagues, in your companies. One, how well it is still, I mean, is it a well-founded, argument or a skepticism, or have we moved beyond that, early years, or is there some truth in the thing? And if it is, then how does one become more efficient from
There's
productivity,
tremendous.
cost?
Sorry.
No, please go. I'm done. Yes.
I mean, it is an absolute truism. So there is a very, very good reason to ask that question in one's own mind, when you're a European company looking at India. And there are multiple Indias. There are Indian companies that, run, design, own, operate, it's everything. 7-star luxury properties, hotels, for example, or resorts that are among the best in the world. And I literally mean the best in the world. And then you also have, other images of India, which are also real. And so the two coexist. It's a very awkward thing to understand for most people. They can't understand how it can coexist, but it does. So there are very different aspects of India. You have world-class education. You have world-class entrepreneurial spirit that goes on to create these islands of excellence, which, depending again on the product and the industry, you very much can create this island, create barriers, put a moat, if you will, around you, and ensure that within your moat, it is world class. Very, very doable. Many companies have done it. And don't let the noise outside bother you. The key is to figure out what filters to put between your operations and the external environment to have the excellence, quality, etc., that you desire. Now, you do have to interact with the outside world, obviously. Otherwise, you can't operate. That is something you have to get used to, or you find an ecosystem of like-minded companies. And just because, I'll just use a German, for example, just because they have a European name or a German name, this is important. Don't assume that every company of that characteristic operates with the same level of quality as they are back home. I'll take some of the logistics companies, for example. They may have a fancy global name on it, but try getting a courier from them on time. Hell, you have hell to pay. Nobody can tell you where it is because many of them have outsourced to multiple levels of outsourcing.
Right.
So just because there's a fancy German name, world class, and you think you have sent a courier and it's very reliable, I'm sorry, but reality might be different. So you have to understand what you're dealing with and go deeper and ask questions. And that's why I talk about the preparation. And I'm sure we talk about it, is how do you then get the right kind of analysis and the quality of judgment? And that's the science by itself, more an art than a science, actually.
Yes, I agree, and I'm sure you have, had your own fair share of mastering that art. When you mentioned that the companies have to be aware of, what they're getting into in India, another topic which always comes up for discussion is localization or adapting their products to India. How important is it? I mean, if it is an international company saying that this is the same quality, same product elsewhere in the world I sell, why should India be any different? Should they be more cognizant of the fact that India might have special needs, which, by the way, baffles everyone outside of India? How can India be so different? You said that there are many Indias within India. Or to what extent would you say that, when it's manufacturing in India, how much should be a localization? Should they focus, not think about it, just copy paste? What's your take on that?
So I think, again, I'm sorry, but it's a very contextual question.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of one of the very, very large and one of the most successful companies in the world in the auto industry. If you look at some of the cars that they have, now to be careful how I say this, but if you look at some of the cars that they have here, they may use a brand name on the car that is the same as the one that's offered elsewhere in the world. But a car with the same name there may be American class in terms of ride and handling, noise, fits and finishes, material quality, etc. But here, it could be, and sometimes is, tinny, it doesn't feel as high quality. So some companies, because they've understood and they're successful, and this is the key, is that they have deliberately chosen to downspec in order to meet the cost requirement and only focus on those features that are really important for the customer in India. So for example, if the fits and finishes, the longevity of the paint quality, some of the weather strips start sort of feeling like they're fraying, or then they say that's fine. Because what happens is very often Indian customers, with the dust and the cleaning of the cars every day, etc., and with the number of scratches you get, people just come and little scratch on your car and move on as if nothing happened. I mean, in Europe, you'd get down and take each other's phone numbers. These differences, people who've understood it have understood what is important. So, for example, in a car, customers really value things that look high tech. They must have different lights and blue and red and green and all the rest of it. It looks like you're in an aircraft, cockpit. That's important. But the feeling, the ride and handling, that safety, etc., may not be important. So each brand has to choose what positioning they want to take, how much they want to adapt their brand from there to here, and how they want to define their success. So this is very possible. It is doable. You should localize smartly. You cannot and will not succeed if you localize blindly and just bring a spec from there to here. You will not.
Okay.
Because there are sooner or later, there are probably in every product category, there's already a company here, I suspect. So you have to have a technology, quality, cost, or a customer fit competitive advantage to succeed. The last thing I would say is materials. Not all materials are available at affordable cost here or competitive cost, which is another reason why localization gets driven. Mm-hmm. And then once you change the materials, you sometimes have to change the manufacturing processes.
Yeah.
So these fine balances are complex. And that's where the initial depth of analysis makes or breaks a company in India.
Okay. So when you talk of complexities, I think another complex variable, which is away from technology and materials and all these things, is the human factor, right? And which also can make or break a company for sure. So when it comes to the talent, availability, quality, their behavior, their way to adapt to the ways of the international company they represent now, they may not have worked there before, itself is a very complex challenge. And I'm sure many companies, I'm sure in your own career in India, you would have had some instances where this was getting difficult. So this could also be a deterrent for many companies, especially those who are not very large companies. How to first get the right talent in India, how to get it adapted to your thought process, not that jugaad, as we say, mentality, right? Things being done the first time right kind of a thing. And admitting mistakes, I mean, which I think is very, very difficult for Indians to admit mistakes, for example. So I could go on, right? But from a Western perspective, from a European perspective, when they look at talent, what would be your observation and what would be your advice to companies to be more hands-on and successful?
So this is one of the trickiest aspects. Very often people meet candidates half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, and they sort of have a very superficial view of it. They go to headhunters who will give you, a pool of candidates or whatever. I think you have to find one person you trust in the country. Okay, and getting that one person you trust, it could be because obviously these are successful businessmen, may not be of a large scale, but in their own little scale, they're very, very successful. They're global people, managers, etc., etc. Usually they will have a connect with somebody in India, through their professional organizations, through their academic background or whatever. And you have to know who that trusted person is you're going to go to get a second opinion. You have to have somebody next to you, if you will, in the initial thing, and use that person or those people you trust to choose your first individual extremely carefully. I cannot emphasize this enough. And this is not about slick communication, European aura around an individual. A lot of people can put that on. It has to be a deep, sincere, committed individual who is buying into your view and is going to be very honest and very transparent with you. Very difficult to assess. There are a lot of slicksters, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
And I'll probably never add, I'm not sure I would like one more job in my career, but I don't think I'll get it because, I'm not a great headhunter kind of a person. Because what happens is typically headhunters choose people whom they know, who can get through interviews and who would be acceptable. And here's the kicker, who will give repeat business to the headhunter. Okay? And I'm
agree,
not
yes.
a guy who gives repeat business to headhunters, unfortunately. So my point therefore being that the motivations of people who are helping you establish in India, you have to understand.
Okay.
And it's very difficult to find that first core group of really good employees. Very difficult. And my advice is have one person you trust in India that is going to hold your hand and help you identify those people, do a thorough check on them, and once you're convinced that they're fine, you bring them to your factory abroad, you inculcate your culture in them, and then you send them back. And along with them, I do strongly recommend one expatriate in the beginning, so that this bridge of culture is clearly established, the trust level is clearly established. So people, the people trust is really important. And more, I really believe strongly in the phrase here, trust but verify. Never ever have blind trust with anybody, never. Have strong audit procedures and be very clear that it's an open, honest, sincere thing. It's not an accusation. It is not a suspicion. It is about a big tool in developing confidence between headquarters and the person there. That only if we are diligent will we also therefore have the confidence to just completely let go, because we go hand in hand.
Okay.
It's really important, and people succeed. I don't want to scare people. All I'm saying is it's really important you do your homework well and you make those first few footsteps in India are very deliberate, very high quality, because that will decide your future. If you fail, it takes a 5 to 7 year period to undo your failures and come back to where you should have been. I don't know if that answers,
I think it does. In fact, you already brought in that sending an expat along with the local Indian colleagues, which is also ways find sometimes the companies are not too comfortable for maybe some of the reasons you mentioned of only hiring locals, and they would send an expat. If he or she does not have prior experience of India, would take another 2, 3, 4 years for this person to really get acquainted with India, and by the time the bus may be gone or the opportunity may be gone, and then so it's I think that was a good point, especially for manufacturing. It could be good that the expat could come in and then help ease the whole process, right? Help everyone, let's say, gel well with the way of doing things, and then move out maybe in a year or two. I think that could be a good strategy, because that perspective is important, which the local colleagues may take more time to bring up to speed.
And it's important because I just want to say one thing because of the people aspect of this. Indians fundamentally want to be left alone to get on with it and deliver the results. They're at heart entrepreneurs. They're very aggressive. They have grown up through a very competitive educational system, and they've had to achieve at every stage of their academic life to get to the next stage of admissions and jobs and so on and so forth. So they do want a free rein. And it's important that they know that there is a timeline over which that rein will get looser and looser, provided the confidence level gets stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
So make sure that expectation is clear up front, that micromanagement will happen in the beginning, it will become macro over time. So please be patient until we can build the bridges and have the strong trust between headquarters and India.
I think that's a very valid point, because that's again where the trust, and you've been emphasizing on the word trust, and in this case, in its truest sense, the trust is very important, and it will be built, over a period of time. I mean, it cannot be on day one, and there is only either 0 or 100% trust. There cannot be 19% trust, I always maintain. So this working collaboratively, I think, is something which definitely makes sense. Actually, you would not believe we already have taken about 30 minutes in our discussion here.
Yes, I know. I can see that.
And we also have to take a few questions. Otherwise, it's getting more interesting at this point, and we could go on for maybe another couple of hours. But let's see if we have some questions. Let me just look at my chat box. Are there any questions? Okay. One of the first questions we have is, what is the most common mistake you saw European companies make?
Blaming India for everything and
Okay.
not wondering whether you have done anything wrong.
Okay, so lack of self introspection also maybe could be thrown in that.
I'm not
Okay.
saying India is blameless, okay, but at the same token, I mean, it's tough, but it's not impossible. And there's sometimes the tendency to just say, oh God, if this was some other country, we wouldn't be here. The question you really have to ask yourself constantly is, am I doing everything? Do I have an open mind? Have I heard everything? Am I processing what I'm hearing? Or am I putting blinders on? Ask yourself that question, because very often the problem lies not in India, but back home.
And which is difficult to admit, I suspect. It's normally difficult to say, okay, fine, I'm at fault.
Why many fail. I mean, which is one of the reasons why many fail.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. There's one more which says, what is the readiness of moving supplies / components to India, and how developed is the supplier base in India? I think you already did allude briefly to this, the ecosystem being there.
Very technology, very component, very product dependent. You have world-class automotive manufacturing in many product categories, where cars are being, the components are being manufactured, cars are being assembled and manufactured and being exported to Europe, to North America, Mexico. I don't know about America yet, but certainly Central and Mexico and southwards, there are cars and also to Europe, certainly cars have been exported from here. So you can get all the materials you need for global standards. I mean, sorry, let me be clear. You can get all the materials you need for global standards in certain product categories. So it's very product category specific. Again, it depends on the volume that you need. How big is the demand for that particular steel or that particular plastic resin, that particular material for conductivity, etc. It's very, very market size driven.
Okay. There's one which says, with the rupee depreciating, will manufacturing in India still be a good investment in the long run?
Not sure I understand the question, because if the rupee depreciating, it's even more interesting.
It's more interesting to export from India.
I think the question really is, for the material that we are importing into India from Europe, maybe the raw materials,
the equipment, or maybe some,
get more expensive.
Yeah.
But if you're importing it, presumably your competitors are also importing it. Presumably,
the same boat.
So they're all in the same boat. If you're importing it and they're not, then you've got a competitive question to ask yourself: why?
Okay. The next one I think is a little interesting. At least I find it interesting. Say, as a veteran in the transportation industry, right? You are an expert and veteran in transportation. How do you see the new fad at the moment, and of course, future of e-mobility? I'm sure you saw it coming probably.
So I started smiling. I was wondering when the EV word would come up once your question
So
started.
yeah, so I think everyone would be curious. I'm myself curious. What's your maybe take in a minute or two on this new animal called e-mobility?
I'd say I was a skeptic till about a year ago. And the
Okay.
reason that I was a skeptic was in 92, 93, which is 30 years ago. I was a European product manager for a General Motors car called the Impact, which eventually became EV1. And this was driven by the California Air Resources Board. There was a lot of environmental stuff going on 30 years ago. So anyway, and we did a lot of product analysis, development. We were ready to launch. I mean, not ready. We were evaluating launching it, etc. And that is 30 years ago. And it's only in 2020, if you look at the statistics of the year ending 2020, the automotive world, I can't remember the exact statistics, but I think it's gone above 2 or 3% for the first time in terms of EV as a percentage of global sales. A large part of that are also new regulations in the EU about fuel economy standards and almost like a cafe kind of a thing that the EU has come with. There are also mega incentives that have been put onto EVs. So that's why I said I was skeptical till about a year ago, until the momentum has started now. Thanks to incentives, partly thanks to greater awareness during the shutdown, where the quality of the air went up. I've been talking about countries like India, and people also realize that maybe there is, when push comes to shove, another lifestyle can be maintained day in, day out, and that maybe you have one car which you take for longer distance vacations or whatever, and one car is your runaround car, while you're at home. So I've become, and of course the cost is an issue, but I think more and more countries are also beginning to believe that it may be perfectly correct for societal benefits to continue to have incentives on electric vehicles. I mean, clearly, if you remove subsidies tomorrow on electric vehicles, the market will crash, and it's going to be a very, very, small steps will only be taken. But I think today people are buying into the fact that the world has to be saved environmentally, and I think subsidies will continue, and people will get used to the fact that they can adapt their lifestyle and transportation cycles in a manner that makes sense to have an EV. But there are many more articles, there are expert articles on how the true environmental impact that is represented by the manufacturing of various materials that go into an electric vehicle and the whole energy cycle. But more and more world is moving away from coal, and I think the more you go into renewables, the greater the case becomes for electric vehicles. So I think I'm beginning to be an optimistic about electric vehicles getting stronger and stronger as a percentage.
Okay, I think I have time just enough for one last question here, and I'm sorry the other questions which I see are pouring in will not have enough time for that. Please feel free to write in your questions in the chat box, and we'll get back to you. But one last question, because trust, I realize I think has caught someone's fancy here. The question is, how do you find the one person to trust? It's I know.
Look at the track record. I mean, I'm assuming you're not going to pick a entry-level person.
No, it's a leadership we're talking of. Yeah.
So look at the track record of the individual. Look at what ethical challenges he's had to face. Ask people who he is. Don't just look at achievements of an individual. Look at the individual. Look at the heart. Go deeper. what's his background? What does he believe in? What tough decisions has he taken in his life to uphold whatever it is that you think are good values to have?
They align with you.
How open is he going to be? With how, for example, I mean, don't get me wrong here. I always believe that my boss has a greater right over my company than me, because he's got a higher level of responsibility. And most probably he's got more stock options in the company than I do.
Yeah.
So I don't take any offense to any questions my boss asks. Other thing is the guy asking you tough questions? Is he afraid to ask you tough questions? Is he challenging? Because somebody who's not challenging you is probably not being honest enough.
Yeah.
Because that means he's hiding the questions he actually wants to ask.
Yeah, that's right.
So you really need to see the individual, get lots of references on the individual, get his history, get, simple things like, the guy claims all kinds of things. You ask for his transcripts. You ask for his references, talk to his previous bosses, his or her. Sorry, in all cases, her also is important. So it's important to go beyond headhunters. I'm sorry, I know that no headhunter is going to ever talk to me again in my life, but Shavikesh, you've been a headhunter, so you know.
I've been a headhunter myself. But I appreciate, the clients like you actually make our life much more easier. I can assure you. Maybe another day we will talk about it. But thank you, Mr. Rao, for your time. I think we are past our, appointed time, scheduled time. But thank you very much for being candid and forthcoming in your views. I think it must resonate with a lot of participants here. It did, because we are in the business. I know a lot of it did resonate with me. But thank you so much for your time and being here. And appreciate you being here. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
One last thing. I know it's really important. It's really important. And I'm not saying this because I'm 61 years old. Please don't get me wrong. Please don't get me wrong. Very often people have a mindset that do not go to experience, to age. Age is a big issue. I actually believe that some of the older people are far better talent, because the process of professional growth that they have been through is very different from what a 40-year-old has been through. And this can be a PhD in itself. But that's one very important thing to do, is do not discount the value of experience and age in assessing a quality of an individual and whether that person will be the right, that kind of team. I'm not talking about an individual.
Yeah.
So keep age aside is very important, because very often the best talent is in the older group.
Okay. I guess point well taken. No, thank you for that. And I guess Europeans anyways are cognizant of this, and they are more aware of this and do lay emphasis, the right amount of emphasis on the age as well. But thank you for that nugget, that parting nugget. Thanks a lot. We really overshot our time, but nevertheless, thank you again for that.